freedom is, to me, clearly the American ideal. Now, freedom doesn't just mean one thing. It means lots of things, and it means lots of things to lots of people. But if you ask Americans from any walk, from any place, apart from justice, freedom is it. That's the story of this country. The experiment we're engaged in is an experiment about how far freedom can go, how it can be created, how it can be sustained. You know, if you think that philosophy is another sort of game from experience, this is the place to find out where it isn't. And that's very clear early on with the American Puritans. For Jonathan Edwards, freedom is a philosophical question. He writes a nice book called On the Freedom of the Will. Do I have a free will? And if I do, what sort of freedom is constituted by it? For Jonathan Edwards, that text is not, in any sense, merely a philosophical text. He's trying to figure out who he is. And out of that, if he can tell the story, he's trying to tell his flock who they are. And what are the limits on what they can do? How should they understand what it is they do? Freedom in Edwards' hands is always a constant argument against the Arminians, those followers of Arminius on the continent, who wanted to argue that freedom was about doing as you please, roughly speaking, that you have the power to do as you please. And from his good old Calvinist take, you're only so free as God allows you to be free. Your freedom is highly constrained, and it really is something to be revealed to you rather than something you own that you can do with what you want. So this story of the telling of that he tells about freedom is a story he tells in order to understand what it is and who he is and the mission that these folks have in New England. But at the same time, it's prescriptive for those who need to be told how they ought to be conducting themselves and how they ought to be interpreting what it is they do. Because your labor and behavior in the world is a sign for Edwards of God's take on who you are and your place in the universe. And this story then unfolds in American culture, and freedom then is told quite differently by Jefferson and by Franklin and by the Constitution. You know, we have Jeffersonian freedom written into the Constitution. We want to be free from European domination and so forth. And the subtext there is we want to be from aristocratic British domination. But then you get the Federalist Papers and the folks who are worried about too much freedom, and they begin to tell the story back again and say, let's have enough government that we don't get too many loose ends here and endanger ourselves and endanger our civilization and culture because we've got folks running around doing as they please, as it were, or states running around doing as they please. So the constraining element of the Federalists, this is the story of freedom. This is not merely, and I want to emphasize that always, merely, it's not just an intellectual conversation about freedom. It's about who we are, what we do, what we should do, and what is our relationship vis-a-vis the rest of the environment, political, social, physical, and so on. And this is just a fascinating story through the rest of American history. Freedom for the Transcendentalists is what they consider a second revolution. You know, we got the first revolution, and that gave us this political thing within which we can work. But for the Transcendentalists, it was about being free from the habits of the culture. They didn't want to be stuck with somebody else's religion or somebody else's politics or somebody else's scientific description of things. They wanted to do it on their own. So the notion of the self-reliance of Emerson is a way of undercutting this. And that opens up spaces for someone like Margaret Fuller to write Women of the 19th Century and say that, look, you gave us nice freedom, as it were, with the French and American revolutions, but you forgot about us. Right? Freedom extends, it includes, and here's the way habitually, not politically, but habitually, you're continuing to oppress us. And she makes this very explicit in the 1840s, in a very powerful text. So this story of freedom then gets expanded, rewritten. You have the Civil War, in which now we come out with Du Bois, someone like W.E.B. Du Bois, after the war asking, now, we've got the technical thing on the table, the war's over. How in the world do we actually get freedom for young African Americans in Georgia and the South? Well, it's a story of education. Well, who's going to educate? How are we going to structure it? How are we going to overcome this habitual antagonism now of the poor white Southerner to the former slave? The story of freedom has to get rewritten all the way up through the civil rights. So the freedom issue in American culture is never a dead issue. It is never an abstract problem of the philosopher. It is always embedded in the cultural fabric of what we do. So this is a nice place to see that philosophy and politics and moral activity are never separated. Okay? And in American culture, freedom, justice, and freedom, justice in the American way. This little thing we borrow from, was it Superman? Right? That's real stuff. Right? And the reason we find it cute, and we find it interesting, is we know it's real. Right? Anyone who's brought up in this culture.